Welcome to English Easy Hub. Join us as we ignite the flames of your English learning journey together.
Please subscribe to watch and embark on your English learning journey. Don't miss out on the exciting content. In this dialogue, Simon seeks advice from his professor on how to effectively use English phrasal verbs to sound more natural in conversation. Recognizing the complexity and importance of phrasal verbs, Simon expresses his challenges with understanding their multiple meanings and incorporating them into his speech. The professor provides insightful guidance on strategies for mastering phrasal verbs, emphasizing the importance of context, exposure, and active practice.
Good morning, Professor. I've been working on improving my English fluency, and I keep coming across phrasal verbs. They seem crucial for sounding more natural, but they also confuse me a lot. Could you help me understand how to use them more effectively in my speech?
Good morning, Simon. Phrasal verbs can indeed be tricky, but mastering them is key to sounding natural in English. They consist of a verb and one or more particles, like take off or give up. The challenge often lies in the fact that their meaning isn't always literal. For example, give up doesn't mean to hand something upwards, but rather to stop trying. Would you like to focus on specific types of phrasal verbs, or are you looking for general advice?
I'd love to start with general advice. I've noticed that native speakers use these phrases almost instinctively. How can I get to that level? I feel like even when I know the phrasal verbs, I struggle to use them naturally in conversation.
That's a great observation, Simon. To use phrasal verbs naturally, it's essential to integrate them into your vocabulary actively. Start by identifying the phrasal verbs that are most commonly used in everyday conversation. Exposure is key. Watching movies, listening to podcasts, and reading books where they are used in context helps a lot. Also, try to think in English, forming sentences in your mind that include these phrasal verbs. When you practice speaking, make a conscious effort to use them, even if it feels awkward at first.
That makes sense. I guess I need to immerse myself more in English to pick up on how these verbs are used in different contexts. But sometimes, I find that there are multiple phrasal verbs that seem to mean the same thing, like look up to and admire. How do I decide which one to use?
Excellent question. While look up to and admire can both express respect or admiration, phrasal verbs often carry a more conversational tone. Using look up to might make your speech sound more natural and less formal. The choice between a phrasal verb and its single-word synonym often depends on the context. In casual conversation, phrasal verbs are usually preferred. However, in formal writing, the single-word alternative might be more appropriate. Practice will help you develop an instinct for which to use.
I see. So, would you recommend focusing on spoken practice more than written exercises for phrasal verbs?
Absolutely, Simon. Spoken practice is crucial. Engaging in conversations, even with yourself, where you consciously use phrasal verbs, will help solidify them in your mind. Recording yourself and listening back can also be a helpful exercise. Don't shy away from making mistakes. Each one is a learning opportunity. Over time, these verbs will become second nature in your speech.
That's really encouraging. I'll definitely try recording myself. One more thing, I've noticed that sometimes the meaning of a phrasal verb changes depending on the context. For instance, pick up can mean to lift something, to learn something quickly, or even to start again. How can I get better at understanding these nuances?
Context is everything when it comes to phrasal verbs, Simon. The key is to pay attention to the sentences in which these verbs are used. When you encounter a new phrasal verb, try to learn it in context rather than in isolation. Reading examples of the verb used in different situations can help you understand its various meanings. Additionally, creating your own sentences using the verb in different contexts can reinforce your understanding.
That's a great idea. I'll start making my own sentences. But sometimes I feel overwhelmed by how many phrasal verbs there are. Is there a way to prioritize which ones to learn first?
You're right. There are indeed many phrasal verbs, and it can be overwhelming. My advice is to start with the most common ones, those that are frequently used in daily conversation. Phrasal verbs like get up, break down, take off, and put off are good starting points. Once you're comfortable with these, you can gradually expand your vocabulary. Focusing on a few at a time is much more effective than trying to learn them all at once.
That's very helpful. I'll start with the basics and build from there. How about using phrasal verbs in formal writing? Are there cases where it's appropriate, or should I avoid them entirely?
In formal writing, it's usually better to avoid phrasal verbs in favor of their single-word equivalents. However, there are exceptions. In less formal pieces, like blog posts or opinion articles, phrasal verbs can make the writing feel more conversational and engaging. The key is to consider your audience and the tone you want to convey. When in doubt, opt for the more formal choice in academic or professional contexts.
I'll keep that in mind. I guess it's all about balance, using them naturally in speech and knowing when to switch to a more formal tone in writing. One last question, Professor. Are there any particular resources or exercises you'd recommend for mastering phrasal verbs?
There are several excellent resources out there, Simon. I'd recommend using phrasal verb dictionaries, which provide definitions and examples in context. Additionally, apps like Quizlet allow you to create flashcards for phrasal verbs, which can be a great way to reinforce your learning. As for exercises, beyond what we've discussed, try writing short stories or dialogues where you intentionally use phrasal verbs. This creative approach can make learning more enjoyable and memorable.
Thank you so much, Professor. This has been incredibly helpful. I feel much more confident about tackling phrasal verbs now. I'll start incorporating them into my practice right away.
You're very welcome, Simon. I'm glad I could help. Remember, mastering phrasal verbs is a gradual process, but with consistent effort, you'll find that they become a natural part of your English. Keep practicing, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have more questions.
I'll definitely do that. Thanks again, Professor. I'm excited to get started.
Before you go, Simon, there's one more thing I want to mention. When you're learning phrasal verbs that have multiple meanings, like take off, which can mean to remove something, become successful suddenly, or leave, it's important to develop a strong sense of context. Contextual clues within the sentence or conversation will guide you. For example, the plane is about to take off clearly refers to leaving the ground, while his business really took off last year means it became successful.
That's really insightful, Professor. I hadn't thought about focusing on collocations, but it makes perfect sense. So, it's not just about memorizing the phrasal verbs themselves but also about understanding the words they commonly appear with. I'll definitely start paying more attention to that. Do you think it would help to keep a journal or some sort of log where I can jot down the different meanings of phrasal verbs I come across, along with example sentences?
Absolutely, Simon. Keeping a journal or log is an excellent idea. Writing down the phrasal verbs you encounter, along with their different meanings and example sentences, can greatly reinforce your learning. This kind of active engagement helps cement the phrasal verbs in your memory. Plus, revisiting your notes regularly will allow you to review and internalize the nuances of each verb.
I really like the idea of categorizing them. It seems like it would make it easier to remember which verbs to use in specific situations. I'm going to start that journal today.
That's a fantastic approach, Simon. Categorizing them by context, theme, or even by frequency of use will help you organize your learning effectively. Remember, the goal is to make these phrasal verbs feel like a natural part of your language, so the more you engage with them in meaningful ways, the better. Keep up the great work, and don't hesitate to ask if you have any more questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm feeling much more confident about tackling phrasal verbs now. I'll start incorporating them into my practice right away, and I'll definitely reach out if I need more help.
You're welcome, Simon. Keep practicing, and you'll see steady improvement. Best of luck with your studies, and remember, language learning is a journey. Enjoy the process.
The conversation concludes with Simon gaining confidence and a clear plan to improve his use of phrasal verbs. The professor highlights the value of context, collocations, and consistent practice in mastering phrasal verbs, encouraging Simon to actively engage with the language and to be patient with his progress. This exchange underscores the significance of phrasal verbs in achieving fluency and the practical steps learners can take to integrate them naturally into their speech.
Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe, like, comment, and share to keep the English learning journey alive.